Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us for our program. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the Cary Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like tonight's event to you. I'd also like to thank the libraries in Ashland and Danvers for partnering with us on this program. Copies of the book are available for purchase through Porter Square Books. I will add the link to the chat. You can also borrow the book from the Minuteman Library Network. This program is being recorded and we posted to the library's YouTube channel. Our format tonight will be a conversation with Deepa, and then we will move into a Q&A. If you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A or chat. Now I'd like to introduce our guest. Deepa Varadarajan lives in Atlanta with her husband and 2 children. She's a law professor and a graduate of Yale Law School. She grew up in Texas and received her BA from the University of Texas at Austin. Her short fiction has appeared in the Georgia Review and Colorado Review, and her legal scholarship has appeared in the Yale Law Journal and many other publications. Late Bloomers is her first novel. Welcome, Deepa. We are so excited to have you join us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Wonderful. Well, I really enjoyed your book. I thought it was funny and heartbreaking, but some of it really resonated with me in so many different ways. And I can see that it would for others as well, because it's about the challenges of relationships, whether you're young or old, and trying to figure out what your life, what to do with your life when you're unhappy. So before we dive into your book, I always find it interesting to talk about an author's writing journey. And we typically have some aspiring writers in our audience. And so wanted you to share what inspired you to begin writing a novel.
Yeah, so I definitely was not one of those people who always knew she wanted to be a writer since the age of 5. Kind of like the title of my book, I consider myself a little bit of a late bloomer when it comes to writing fiction. I didn't even begin until I was in my 20s. Like many writers, I was a really big reader from a very young age. I grew up in a small college town in Texas, not unlike the setting of this book. And when I was growing up there in the 80s and the 90s, you know, my family was one of the few Indian American families in town, and I was one of the few Indian Americans at my school, and I always felt a little bit like an outsider. And like a lot of outsiders, I found a lot of solace in reading fiction. So I was always a big reader. But it didn't occur to me to start writing until much later. And I'm not sure I would have had the confidence really to think about being a writer before my 20s. It wasn't until college really that I first read any book of fiction by a woman of South Asian origin. In college, I remember reading books by Jhumpa Lahiri and Arundhati Roy and others, and just feeling the first spark of something, thinking to myself, would such a thing even be a possibility for someone who looks like me, you know? And then after graduating from college, I went to law school. And law school was the place where I really started thinking, okay, I want to give this fiction writing thing a try, which is maybe a weird realization to have in law school. But I that's where I really started thinking, okay, I want to try this. And there were actually some people around me who were writing and publishing novels. And it, you know, I think there's something about being in physical proximity to people who are doing the thing that you're kind of dreaming of doing that makes you start thinking to yourself, okay, maybe I can try doing this. And so I graduated from law school in the early 2000s, and I was working at a law firm, not in New York, not unlike the kind that Nikesh, the son character in this book, is working at. And it was not a job that suited me very well. I was not very happy being a corporate lawyer at a big law firm. And so once a week, I had enrolled in this fiction writing class, this creative writing class. And one evening a week, I would go and I would start workshopping some pages of fiction that I had written. These sort of my first attempts at writing fiction. And I loved it. I was hooked. It was the thing I looked forward to more than anything every week. And ever since then, fiction writing has been a part of my life.
That's wonderful. I'm glad you were able to find a writer's workshop and kind of like hone your skills.
Yeah, and I mean, you did mention that there were aspiring writers potentially listening, and I think that being a part of a workshop and actually seeing people's reactions to things that you have written, that was really important to me, especially early on, to help me understand, what is working, what's not working, what do I need to change. So yeah, workshops have been incredibly helpful to me.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so let's dive into your book. So for those who haven't read it, could you give us a synopsis of your book and then read your favorite passage to give the audience a taste of your book?
Sure. So I've always been fascinated by this idea of second chances and reinvention. Like, are you ever too old to change your life, or can you make a change at any age? And I decided to explore this idea through this story about an Indian American family in a college town in Texas. And the couple, or I should say the ex-couple at the center of this story, Suresh and Letha Raman, they have recently divorced after 36 years of an arranged marriage. It was Letha's decision to initiate divorce. It was one that she struggled with. And now they're both in the process of starting over. Letha has her first job outside the home at a university library, which she loves. And a professor who works at that university and frequents the library has taken an interest in her and asked her out. And this is a very new and nerve-wracking experience for her. And meanwhile, her husband, Suresh, or ex-husband, Suresh, is experimenting with online dating. And surprise, surprise, it is not going at all how he expected it would go. And there are two adult children, Priya, their 35-year-old daughter, and Nikesh, their 30-year-old son. They are struggling to sort of adapt to these changes in their parents' lives. And at the same time, they're going through some very messy relationship challenges of their own, things that they're hiding from their parents. So all of the characters in the story, the four family members, they're hiding things from one another. They're discovering secret sides of one another, things that they don't like, things that they have to learn how to accept. And that's one of the things that they're going to have to go through in this book, trying to figure out how they can sort of let the people they love evolve in these unexpected ways and still sort of come back together as a family. Wonderful. Oh, and you mentioned a passage, so I will read a passage. I have many favorite passages in the book. It's hard for me to choose one, but I think since there are probably people here who haven't read the book, what I'll do is I'll just start at the beginning. So the first chapter is from Suresh, the father's point of view. Each of the chapters in this novel alternate between the different family members' point of view. And so I'm going to start with Suresh. All these internet women lie, I tell you, all of them. Funny that the anonymity draws everyone in, but it's also what keeps you from trusting a word. Sometimes the lies are about the fundamentals, previous marriages, whether they have kids, what line of work they're in. Oh, and age. Age is a big one. The last date I went on was with a woman whose profile said 41. Impossible. There wasn't a chance that Ms. Mittal, formerly Mrs. Mittal, was a day under 50. My son Nikesh laughed at me when I told him about that one. But Dad, he said, you are 59. Well, that may be, but I didn't go around grossly exaggerating for sport. I was more reasonable about it all. On my profile, I described myself as Suresh Raman, a healthy and active 5'10", 55-year-old divorced man of Indian origin. All right, so 55 was 4 years ago. The height was a rough estimate, and active was only an accurate description if it included toenail clipping while watching CNN in my carpeted den. But these were reasonable deviations from truth. RDTs, I called them. So long as you kept it reasonable, where was the harm, really? It was early evening now. I parked my SUV in front of a small white brick house. I had to quash my misgivings for the next few hours at least. I reminded myself, this was a first date, a new woman, a clean slate.
I have to admit that when I first read the book in that opening paragraph, it made me laugh aloud because it was just, just talking about online dating, and we all know how challenging it could be. But just, the fact that he's kind of has this idea that everyone's lying already is just kind of like funny. But I just wanted to show the book. It's got a beautiful cover if anyone could see that. Yeah, the screen doesn't allow us to. So perfect.
There you go.
Yeah, it probably looks better because I have the screen in the back. So, Deepa, can you just tell us what was the inspiration for your story, and were the characters based on people you knew or met?
Yeah, so the story and the characters in it are all a product of my imagination. But I would say the sort of first spark of the idea for this kind of story probably began about 20 years ago. At the time, I was actually dating an Indian American man whose parents had recently divorced, and his dad was experimenting with online dating. And at the time, I remember thinking, this is kind of a brave thing to do, doing something outside your comfort zone later in life. And at the same time, I was in my 20s, and I was going through these various relationship challenges at the time. And all of that got me thinking, I have never read a story about a recently divorced Indian couple, my parents' aged, and their adult children all going through romantic turmoil at the same time. I think I'd like to read that kind of story. Maybe I could try my hand at writing that kind of story. So that sort of kind of was one spark. And the other thing I will say is that the ex-couple at the center of the story, Lata and Suresh, they had an arranged marriage. Theirs did not work out. My parents also had an arranged marriage. Lucky for me, theirs is a good one. They're actually a very compatible couple. They've been married for about 5 decades. But there were definitely, points along the way in my growing up where the sort of how they met and how they didn't know each other very well when they got married was always this sort of object of fascination for me. And, there were various points growing up where I thought to myself, okay, well, what if all this had just gone another way? What if like some Indian American friends of mine and their parents, it had all just gone differently. And so in some ways, this novel is sort of that what if, that imaginary alternate path, and so all of these things were sort of sloshing around in my brain as sort of the inspiration for the story.
Thanks. And so you did talk about the fact that Lata and Suresh are experiencing or going through a divorce. But each person in the Raman family also has relationship challenges, specific Priya and Nikesh. Why was it important for you to have them share those experiences of like having difficulty in their relationships?
Yeah, so I've always been very interested in intergenerational stories of sort of conflict, particularly in immigrant families. And I will say one thing about the members of this family is they have trouble communicating with each other honestly. And there's a lot of sort of avoidance and miscommunication. And this is one of the things that they're going to have to learn to sort of overcome, right? To how to sort of not just avoid talking about difficult topics with one another, how not to sort of stew in resentments, but instead try to change their patterns of being a family and being sort of more honest in their relationships with one another. And so for that reason, I thought it was important to me that over the course of this novel, they learn to tell each other more about their lives, their relationship difficulties, the various things that they are going through. You mentioned, Priya and Nikesh, even though they are adults, Priya is 35, Nikesh is 30, they still hide things from their parents, things about their relationship, things that they're embarrassed of. For example, Priya is in this having this affair with the married man, and she, is embarrassed to share that for some obvious reasons. And, they're each of them are hiding things from one another. The parents, I guess the sort of twist in this is that the parents as well are embarrassed to share aspects of their lives with their children, with their post-divorce dating lives. They're worried about being judged or being embarrassed, through the sharing of that information with other members of their family. So part of their journey in this book is learning how to get over that avoidance and that unwillingness to communicate with one another and try to have more sort of honest relationships with each other.
Yeah, I did feel that there was like a lack of communication in terms of, at just one point when Lata just didn't even know where her daughter was. And I was like, if you just talk to each other, but because they were hiding things from each other, they were like always just not communicating as effectively as they should.
Yeah. And, as I mentioned, one of the aspects of this book is that, every chapter is told from a different family member's perspective. And, part of the reason I like that as a reader and part of the reason I like that as a writer is that you can see sort of the same event, the same things in the past, the same things in the present, filtered through each of their eyes and their perceptions. And there are so many moments in the book where you think to yourself, you guys just need to talk to each other and communicate more honestly. So, yeah.
And what I also like about the fact that you have the chapters separated and each person's voice is the evolution of their relationship, the evolution of what they're going through and how eventually they get to a better place. And I like the way it's told in that manner.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And then so we did talk about the fact that Lata interviewed at a library, which I loved, and then got a job there. So here she befriends a young woman named Deanna. Why did you decide to give her a younger friend instead of someone who is a peer who might be her age that she could talk to and share her experiences with?
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with Deanna's character. She was one of actually my favorite characters to write. She is, as you said, very young. She's in her 20s. She's sort of this fearless, kind of almost overly honest to a fault. She always says what she thinks kind of person. And, I wanted to give Letha a friend like her in part because, Letha is going through all of these new and unfamiliar and intimidating experiences for her, from, having a job outside the home for the first time to living on her own for the first time. So she was someone who got an arranged marriage at the age of 20. She kind of went straight from her parents' house to her husband's house. So this has been her first experience of living on her own, right? She's dating for the first time. She's never really had the experience of doing that. And so, I wanted to sort of give her a friendship with someone like Deanna, who would kind of encourage her to be brave, to take chances, to try new things, who would be a sounding board, but wouldn't judge her or cause her to feel embarrassed. And, Letha is someone who she does have a lot of friendships. She's a well-liked person. She's had these long-standing friendships in her Indian community in town with these women and they've gone through a lot together. They've had children at the same time. They've raised their children at the same time. They've, mourned their parents' deaths together. I mean, they've gone through a lot. But at the same time, Letha feels like some of the things that she's experiencing, her divorce, her post-divorce dating life, these are things that she doesn't feel comfortable sharing with them. And she feels sort of embarrassed or judged. And with Deanna, there's none of that. It's almost like she can kind of operate a bit on a clean slate and be a bit of a new version of herself in the way that I think sometimes you can do with a new friend who has nothing to do with your existing community, right? You can kind of be this new version of yourself. And she needs that. And I don't know that that's something she would have been able to do in quite the same way with someone, closer to her own age who is from her own community.
Yeah, I agree. And so she ends up dating Professor Len Greenberg. And I don't think she would have done that without Deanna pushing her, because with someone maybe her age would probably say, oh, you need more time to kind of like think through what you want in life after this divorce. So I really do like Deanna's character.
Yeah, or it might be other people, her own age who are also going through dating and having sharing horror stories, which might scare her,
Right.
So I think there's something about, sharing this with someone who is younger, who is her friend through work, and is someone who gets a lot out of her relationship with Letha as well. I mean, she's someone who, is kind of a loner too, and who is seeking friendships and for whatever reason has trouble making them with people her own age. And so, this is sort of an unlikely but very important friendship, I think, for both of them.
Yes, and I think it's reciprocal also in the way that I don't think Deanna is very close to her mom. Is that correct? And so
Yeah.
I don't know if Lata plays a role for her as well in a reciprocal kind of relationship there.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there is a little bit of a maternal kind of role. I mean, early on, she mentions worrying about Deanna not eating enough or eating really unhealthily, like popcorn and Reese's Pieces, peanut butter cups. And so she's bringing her, idli and lemon rice and these South Indian dishes that she makes at home. And she will send to her own daughter. She'll like bring them with her to the library during the lunch breaks and try to get Deanna to eat some of it too. So there is some of that. Yes.
Yeah. Um, for the audience, if you have any questions for Deepa, feel free to stick them into the Q&A or chat and we can get to those later. So you talked about the fact that you liked Deanna's personality. How did you decide on the personalities to give to each of your characters?
Yeah, so writing this novel was a very long and windy process for me. I I first started writing the character. I wrote each of these characters at like very different points in time, and so the Suresh character kind of came to me first. When I write, I don't tend to outline or anything like that in advance, and so I generally start with a character's voice and a scene, and then I sort of build out from there. And so the first character I had started writing was Suresh. And I started it many, many years ago. And when I first started it, I didn't know it was going to be a novel. I actually thought it was just going to be a short story. I was writing it in the context of that very first writing class I mentioned to you. And so when I started it, I kind of thought it was just going to be a short story about this particular moment in time in this man's life who was sort of figuring out how to put the pieces of his life back together after a divorce. And he was internet dating. And at the time I started, online dating was kind of this new thing. It wasn't this like ubiquitous thing that it is today. Everyone meets that way now. But back when I started, it was more uncommon, especially for, an Indian American man of his age group. And so I was sort of interested in looking at that. And it was less about his relationships with his family members. And so I worked on that short story probably on and off for about a year, and I kind of couldn't get it to work. And so I just put it away and started working on other things, other projects. And then I came back to it actually a few years later because I hadn't forgotten about Suresh. And when I came back to it, I started thinking more and more about his ex-wife Lata and his daughter Priya, and their voices and their characters' personalities started becoming clearer and clearer in my mind. And I realized I wanted to try writing from each of their points of view as well. And then once I started doing that, that's when I realized, okay, this is not a short story anymore. This is clearly a novel. And it's a novel about this family and this period of turmoil and change that they are in, and how they are all sort of discovering these secret sides of one another and growing apart, but also trying to figure out a way to come back together. And so, I kind of developed their characters and personalities at pretty different points in time over several years, kind of on and off. And Nikesh was like the son character, took me the longest to find. And in fact, I wrote probably the first third of the novel without his voice at all. He was a character, but there were no chapters from his point of view. And at some point, I realized that that wasn't working and that I really needed Nikesh to be a part, to have a voice in it as well. And so his was sort of the last voice that I really understood and was able to develop. So his kind of took me the longest to find. So the long answer to your question is, I'm not sure when I started at the very beginning, I had a very clear sense of each of their personalities. It was sort of kind of one by one, and it really developed over time from, as I said, this short story that was just going to be about a few bad dates that Suresh went on to something being much larger than that, a story about this family.
Yeah. And was it difficult at all to kind of decide what type of personality you would give to Priya? Because, she's the daughter. And, to me, she seems to be, somewhat of an angry child, but, rightfully so. I think she's, got a lot of baggage, emotional baggage.
No, I mean, it's interesting. I had in the way that I had a lot of fun writing Deanna, I also had a lot of fun writing Priya, because Priya is another person who sometimes is maybe too honest to a fault, is a little tactless, says things sometimes that maybe she should censor and sort of keep inside. But but it makes her a very fun character to write. She's also got some sort of bratty tendencies, and but at the same time, you're right. She is carrying around a lot of baggage. She does feel, she's not as supportive as her brother is about her parents' dating lives. And I think part of that stems from the fact that she kind of always felt that she had to hide her relationships from her parents because it made them uncomfortable when she was growing up. And she kind of feels like these tables have turned. And there's one scene in the book where she says something like, I had to hide my dating life from my parents for a decade, and now I have to cheer on my dad, like at brunch, like we're Carrie and Samantha on Sex and the City. She's like, no, I'm not okay with that. So, she has these struggles that she has to work through. So I hope readers don't walk away with a feeling of just, oh, she's so bratty and difficult. I hope there is some understanding of like the complexity behind that and the reasons that she sort of is the way she is.
Oh, I think that definitely is. And you see that as the story evolves, that, she's got this emotional baggage, but then she kind of like learns that, she needs to kind of like further develop that relationship with her father and her parents, and, with her brother as well. I don't want to give like too much away. But so you talk about the fact that you really enjoyed developing Deanna's character. Was there another character that you really enjoyed developing as well?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I will say I love all four of these characters. I think one of the things about working on a novel off and on for so long is like, I like to joke that I have known these characters now longer than I have known my husband or my children. So I'm very fond of them, and I love them all, warts and all. Some of them are harder to love than others, but I care about them. Though I will say, over the course of writing and revising the novel, Lata really became my favorite character. And she's someone who, even though we are very different and we're in different stages of life and situations, I found myself relating to her a lot, and also really rooting for her happiness in ways that, not to say that I'm not rooting for all of the characters' happiness, but for her, she was she became kind of special for me of the four characters.
Yeah, I really liked her character as well. She was very nurturing.
Mm-hmm.
As she should be as a mother.
But then she has her moments too. I won't mention a certain cell phone throwing at somebody's head moment, but she definitely, she has her hot-headed moments too. So it's not that she's sort of saintly and always maternal. She's complicated. She's got her good days and her bad days. But there's definitely, I think over the course of writing her character, and again, because I wrote this book off and on over a long period of time, I grew older and I had kids and I went through these various life experiences myself. And so I also wonder if that's part of the reason that over time she kind of became my favorite.
Yeah, I like her a lot too. You talked about how you think of yourself as a late bloomer. And how did you decide on the title for this book? Was it because of that aspect of your life that you were a late bloomer and becoming a writer, or is it someone that in particular in the book that kind of made you decide that this was the title you wanted?
It was less reference to me, and it was really more a reference to the characters in the book, and particularly, Lata and Suresh, who, again, they had this unsuccessful arranged marriage. They didn't really have the experience of connecting in quite the way that maybe they would have hoped in life. And this is sort of a second act for them, right? And so there was that. There was also, I guess that was the main reason for the title. But I will say all of the characters are going through this period of sort of reinvention and reorientation in their life, right? Trying to figure out how to find happiness in their individual lives, but also as a family. And so they're all in that sense sort of blooming late. And then there's also sort of the more literal, the fact that one of the things that Suresh has discovered about himself post-divorce is that he has a green thumb. He has a real knack for gardening and nurturing plants. And even though sometimes he has difficulty communicating and connecting with his own family members, he's awfully good at nurturing things in the soil and seeing them bloom. And that has been a real surprise and a real actual source of pride and happiness for him.
Wow, that would be a good source of pride for me as well if I could have a green thumb.
Yeah, I don't know how to keep any plants alive. So I think there was something
No,
maybe aspirational about that.
exactly, exactly. So the novel resonates with me because my parents had an arranged marriage, and you said that as well. And I often wonder if they would have chosen each other if they had not been matched. And so, are there other parts of the novel that resonate with you besides the fact that, you know, your parents had arranged marriage as well?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, being kind of inspired by my own life, I mean, the setting of the novel is certainly inspired by my own life and experiences. Like, as I mentioned, I grew up in a university town in Central Texas, on which the fictional town in this book is loosely based. And, one of the interesting things about Texas is it has one of the largest Indian American communities in the United States. It's something like the third or the fourth largest. And I remember, when I started this book, I'd always wondered, I don't think I've ever seen a novel about an Indian American family set in Texas, and yet there are so many Indian American families in Texas. And so, that was one of my motivations for setting the novel where I did, and that's very much, was based on my own sort of experiences growing up there, wanting to set it in a town like the one where I grew up.
So we talked a little bit about this, how your book centers around the theme of second chances. And obviously you believe in second chances because you have written this novel. Can you share another story about second chances, or just the fact that you've written this novel is your second chance?
My biggest story, I mean, the one that's most on my mind at the moment, because for me, I'm a debut novelist in my mid 40s, and this was not a book. Some people have a story of, writing a novel quickly and finding an agent quickly and getting published quickly, and that really wasn't my story. Like, this was something that took me a long time. I did it while also, pursuing a law career. I'm still a law professor. I had 2 kids. There was lots of rejection along the way in trying to get this, to have a published novel. And, so there was a lot of rejection and heartbreak along the way, and a lot of moments where I thought to myself, okay, this wasn't meant to be. I'm not going to do this, and almost giving up. And so, for me, this really is a sort of second act, and, second chance, second act. So I probably have other stories of second chances and second acts. It's just, this is the one that is most on my mind this year.
Yes, and so we're so glad that you did not give up, because this is a wonderful book. And so I wanted to ask, what aspects of Indian culture do you hope readers will take away from your story?
Yeah, I mean, certainly one of the joys of reading fiction is to immerse yourself in other cultures, other customs that you might not be as familiar with. And certainly there are so many references in this book to, food. There's so much food. If you love books about food, there is a lot of food in this book. And, this is a Tamil speaking South Indian family, and there's references to lemon rice and dosa and sambar and these foods that I grew up eating and that were very important. It was actually an important way of connecting, having meals together and having these events that centered on meals. And so there's a lot of that in this book. And there is, I think, a lot of joy to reading, as I said, about other cultures and cuisines and customs, and that's all wonderful. But I don't know that I would say that there are specific cultural elements or specific aspects of Indian culture that I hope people take away from this novel. Because I think, or I hope, one of the other joys of reading this book for readers will be to see how many things may resonate for you, even if you are not Indian American, right? So a lot of the preoccupations of this book are things like, how does one deal with divorce? How does one deal with a reinvention in the second act later in life? How do you deal with aging parents or adult sibling relationships that have grown distant? So I think there's, how do you deal with parenting, not just young children, but adult children, which poses its own challenges, right? And so I think there's a lot of themes and aspects of this book that I think will resonate with many people. And, that's one of the joys of reading fiction too, right? That even though you're reading about people who are in another culture or another ethnicity or a region of the world you don't know very well, there's a lot about us that resonates, and these moments of connection that make you think, oh, that we have a lot in common. So
yes, I was going to say that it's a lot of commonality. So I'm one of the readers who loves to read about different cultures and the food that they make, because it connects you in a way.
yeah, there was one moment during revision where I was thinking to myself, have I mentioned lemon rice too many times? Is lemon rice like a character in this book? Should I take out some of these references? But again, even though, some of these characters, for example, Leta sometimes has trouble communicating honestly with her daughter and vice versa, but Leta shows a lot of her love through food. That is kind of a way that she communicates. And, so I'm glad that you enjoyed those food references.
Yeah, I did. And I think most parents do show their love through food. So who do you love to read when you're not writing?
Oh wow, so many writers. I have always loved sort of witty, heartfelt stories about dysfunctional families and intergenerational conflict, especially, in immigrant families. And so those are often the kind of books that I like to read and always have liked to read. Probably also why I was inspired to write that kind of book. I think a good piece of writing advice I've always gotten is write the kind of book that you like to read. And I've tried to take that advice. So yeah, I it's too many authors to name, but certainly, funny, heartfelt stories about family dysfunction. Those are some of my favorite kinds of stories.
Yeah, and I love the heartfelt stories because it brings you closer to the characters. And so what are you working on next?
Well, I am at the very early stages of something. I hope it grows into a novel. It too is about an Indian American family and secrets and adult sibling relationships and old wounds and regrets and forgiveness, and so some similar themes. But we'll see how it goes. I think one of the joys and mysteries of writing a novel is that it's hard to know if it will really come together until you're done with the draft. So that's what I'm working on now.
Wonderful. Oh, let me just open this up. I think there's one question. Thank you. Enjoying this author talk. Could you please take us on your journey of finding an editor and a publisher?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, for me, this was quite a long and windy process. The first thing typically that you have to do in order to get published is to find an agent. And the way you typically do that is you write, query letters. You try to create a list of agents who you think would be a good fit for you, who have represented authors who write things in a sort of similar vein to yours. And you create a list, and then you send out query letters, and you go through that process. And then hopefully, an agent will take you on and decide to represent you. And then once that happens, you typically go through a few more rounds of editing, and then the agent sends it to editors that they think would be a good fit for you. They're almost like your matchmaker, I guess. And then that's sort of the process. And then an editor decides that they wanted to acquire the book. And so that's the process. And, I think a lot of people have to kind of go through various rounds, especially at the trying to get an agent stage, figuring out how to write a query letter and kind of figuring out, is your draft at a finished enough state that you are ready to send it out? And so those are all the kinds of decisions that you make and sort of struggle with and try to figure out, how to do. And there's almost like no easy way or shortcut to doing it. You just kind of have to do it and make some mistakes and, keep trying. I think that's my biggest advice for any aspiring writer, is just kind of be persistent. If you really believe you have a story worth telling, power on through the rejections, revise it, and, keep submitting.
Wonderful. Another question is, with your writing group, did you bounce any ideas off of them? I am in a writing group.
Oh, okay. So typically what in my writing groups that I have participated in, it wasn't so much for idea generation. I mean, actually, I take that back. One of the very first creative writing courses that I did, it was in New York, and it was a place called the Writer's Studio. And in the very first class, the first class that I took, the teacher would sometimes give you a prompt, or they would say, try to write 2 pages featuring an unreliable narrator and first person point of view. And sometimes getting a prompt like that can really kind of, stir some idea in you, or get you thinking about telling a story in a way that you had not originally thought about telling it, right? And you try it out, you do a couple of pages, and then you bring the pages to the workshop, and people have a chance to read it or hear it. I think in that workshop, we had to read it out loud, the 2 pages, to everyone, and then get reactions. And so, so in that sense, I guess there is some idea generation in the sense of like providing prompts that might give you an idea and jog something for you, so it can be really helpful in that way too.
Out of curiosity, who did you have read your first draft?
Oh, when it was fully finished, actually, one of my best friends from law school, who was also my roommate for a few years in law school, she reads more fiction than anybody I know. And I knew, so we have similar tastes. So I think one of the things you figure out along the way, and workshops are helpful for this too, you figure out who is your reader, right? Like, sometimes feedback from somebody who is not inclined to like this genre of writing, sometimes their feedback is not always super helpful because they want it to be a totally different type of thing. So I think part of what you're trying to figure out is like, okay, who is the right reader for me? Who can give me like constructive criticism that I can do something with, but is not the sort of feedback that's basically like, turn this into a mystery novel and add 3 murders to it. You know what I mean? It's just not exactly helpful. So, I think that's part of figuring it out. And for me, I've been very lucky in that, one of my best friends is a great reader for me. And I think I said in my acknowledgements, I think she read more drafts of this than anyone should have to. But she was the first person to read the full draft. So yeah. And she gave me great feedback. So
that's wonderful. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I want to thank Deepa for joining us today. Everyone should just run out and get the book, whether if you purchase it from Porter Square Books or if you borrow it online from the Minuteman Library Network. We look forward to reading your next novel. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Everyone have a good night.